Before the one company that we know today, there were two, Squaresoft and Enix. These two companies' leading products, Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, were the fiercest of competitors and would fuel a great debate among Japanese gamers between the two giants. Final Fantasy VI in particular is when the series saw a massive upshoot in quality and began to become a more dominant force. While these two games are still absolutely dominant forces in today's Japanese gaming industry, thanks to a recent interview done in Famitsu and translated by Canera, on the upcoming 25th anniversary of Final Fantasy VI, we learned just how big of an influence the ambition of surpassing Dragon Quest had on its developers. The interview had many of the original staff behind the game, including the legendary and father of Final Fantasy, Hironobu Sakaguchi. First and foremost, what may shock you in this interview is that they were asked how long it took to develop Final Fantasy VI. The interviewer asked, quote, about how long did it take from start of development until it went gold, to which Hironobu Sakaguchi replied it was about 1 year. Graphic director Kazuko Shibuya then added in that development started immediately after Final Fantasy V was completed, so it was actually about a little less than 1 year. This may come across as a surprise that one of the highest quality video games ever made, especially an RPG, was made in a little under a year. In fact, we only just recently found out that the game's iconic World of Ruin wasn't even planned to be in the game from the start, but the team was so ahead of schedule they decided to add it in. Hironobu Sakaguchi stated that the reason for this was because, quote, we initially didn't plan to make the World of Ruin at all. The game was coming along more smoothly than we expected, so we were able to free up some time in our schedule before the game released and implemented that. The game's director, Yoshinori Kitase, added in, we originally planned for the party to save the world and defeat Kefka, just as things were looking grim and the world was about to be destroyed. Then we started talking about reworking that, and that's how the iconic World of Ruin was born. This was such a vastly different time than our modern era, where now a new Final Fantasy takes ages to see the light of day. It makes me reflect on just how bloated the current generation of game development is compared to how it used to be. It wasn't an easy year either. Much of the development team was working such ridiculous hours that they were literally sleeping at work. Hironobu Sakaguchi stated that he would often crash at his desk chair. Meanwhile, director Yoshinori Kitase said that he would often bring a sleeping bag. Minoru Akao said he would bring a small futon mattress that would spread out. It was this incredible level of passion that fueled Final Fantasy VI to the top of its success. The interviewer interpreted this that they were just so committed to creating something high quality that they were even willing to spend the night, but Hironobu Sakaguchi has a different interpretation of it. He said what focused their efforts so sharply was a deep desire to usurp Dragon Quest. Sakaguchi saying, quote, a lot of it was influenced by Dragon Quest. Dragon Quest just had this unique vibe about it, along with a spectacular scenario from Yuji Horii-san. We were mostly fired up with a rival mentality, thinking we must surpass them, rather than thinking we'll make something top class. Having a direct competitor is what helped make Final Fantasy VI such a masterpiece. Flash forward to today and Final Fantasy doesn't have a direct competitor anymore. And perhaps it could be argued that so many people feel that the games aren't as good as they used to be, and don't push the boundaries anymore because they don't have that competitor. Director Kitase said in the days of Final Fantasy V, Sakaguchi was working with the mentality that if they couldn't beat Dragon Quest in terms of overall game quality, then he could at least beat them by having a larger number of mainline entries, and that Squaresoft could ultimately win through frequency. Sakaguchi saying, quote, I figured we couldn't beat them head on when it came to the games themselves, so yeah, he laughed. However, ever since the first Final Fantasy, I always felt that we wouldn't lose when it came down to graphics. Of course, we did put in effort into systems and scenarios, but that was one part I used to be confident we could beat Dragon Quest in. Rightfully so, as Final Fantasy VI has some of the best graphics that any Super Nintendo game has to offer, save for maybe Chrono Trigger. Sakaguchi closed with a statement, it might sound like I'm patting myself on the back, but for an older game, Final Fantasy VI is still a very fun game today. From here, video games entered a world of 3D, and the scale of video games kept growing, but I felt that this in its own way is still a game that can be enjoyed today. This gives us a lot of perspective on the Final Fantasy series as it stands now. This idea of having a faded rival that the series has to surpass created an environment and mentality where the developers on opposing ends weapons must bring their A game in order to create the very best product. Flash forward to today and Final Fantasy is unsure of who its competitor actually is. It outsells every JRPG by a long shot, except for maybe Pokemon. And now it tries to compete with Western RPGs, but at the cost of diluting its own formula. So who should Final Fantasy's rival be at this point? Well, it seems like Final Fantasy's rival is Final Fantasy. That is to say, it's the series past that rivals the present. This is best exemplified with Final Fantasy VII Remake. So Ultima Weapons, will you be playing Final Fantasy VI to commemorate its 25th anniversary? It may only be a few of you, but were you more of a Dragon Quest person than a Final Fantasy person? Or do you just love both of these series altogether? Subscribe, click the bell icon, and let me know in the comments below. And if you've been enjoying my content, be sure to check me out on Twitter at @TheNightSkyPrince_. Link in the description below. Today's Patreon shoutout goes out to Joe Peterson. Shout out to them and the rest of the Ultima community.